Hey everybody, so I'm back with another review, and this time we're going to be talking about the end of Micheline and Layton's first run on Iron Man. We're doing Iron Man number 140 to 157. So this is sort of just collectively the end of their first run. There's not a lot of through lines to this. It's all just kind of wrapping up the character threads and the arcs that Tony and Beth went on, and sort of the evolution of their relationship. I mentioned that in the first story, it's about pushing Tony over a hill, and the hill is alcoholism. And then in the second review, we talked about how it's just this is Tony as a new person. Let's see him just kind of interact with things and see what he does. Fitting in with that theme, this portion of the story is now that Tony has sort of tested the waters and kind of consolidated himself. Let's take away most of what we gave him, and let's throw him into the same situations that he faced pre-recovering from the alcoholism, and see if he still makes the same choices, or see if he's grown at all as a person. Very Iron Man 3 in that way. And to just get right into it, this is a lot better than the second wave of issues, 129 to 139. This is very much a solid through line of a character arc for both Beth and for Tony. Beth has this whole thing in the first 2/3 of the run where she doesn't like relying on people. And at the same time, she wishes she could be strong enough that other people can rely on her. And she lost her ex-husband because she wasn't able to kind of stand up for herself or help him through anything because she was just so timid. And so eventually she becomes stronger and becomes this really, really authoritative person. And that's sort of what helped Tony get through the alcoholism, because she was his rock. And now you get into the other side of that, and what the problem is for Beth to overcome is that when you want to be so self-sufficient, you run the risk of getting into unnecessary danger just because you want to prove you don't need anyone. And that's kind of where Tony was at the beginning of this. So it's interesting that she sort of has a reverse arc to Tony's. And she doesn't take anyone's advice. She doesn't wait for any kind of support. She doesn't let people in. She just does her thing because she feels like she needs to be the strong person in everyone's life. And she doesn't see the hypocrisy of trying to move Tony past that and still being that way herself. And her past kind of comes back to haunt her at the end of this, and she doesn't get the clear-cut resolution that Tony got, because she finds out that her husband is still alive, and so she has to, because of this strong-willed arc that she has to see all of that through to the end without anyone's help. And when she gets her husband back, she has to stay with him and help him out, and sort of complete that loyalty and that obligation, and she breaks it off with Tony. And then a lot of that you feel like could have been avoided or could have been cleaner on her end if she just let Tony in on what was going on. And it's not condemning her character, it's not condemning Tony's character. It's just an interesting fact that she sort of lost the battle that she helped Tony win. Tony, on the other hand, is facing people like the Unicorn, facing people like Whiplash, who is now Blacklash, and losing his company he didn't lose his company, but it got burned down. The building itself got burned down, so he's losing like physical things around him. And he has to see if he's become a better person through all of that. He's got all these moments where he resents being left alone, or at least he's trying to overcome that. He overcome being alone, because the story opens with all of his friends are doing other things, and he's okay with that. He's completely fine. He kind of like welcomes just having some time to himself, and then he keeps losing things, and he keeps losing people, and he keeps getting into conflict, and then when everyone has other things they need to do, he's kind of angry about it. And the new arc that kind of keeps him away from the bottle is that he can't self-pity. He has to just keep working. He has to keep his mind active and not let that kind of anger or fear or loneliness consume him. And whether you're with people or you're not, as long as your mind's still active and engaged and pursuing something, you are better off for it. And it helps him become more human. It helps him become more relatable, because I mean, this is a really rich guy that's got a multi-billion-dollar company, and they never stop making fun of that, in the sense that Tony talks about all these problems they have, and then Rhodey's like, yeah, I totally understand how much of a headache this can be while I'm parking your Lear jet while you're in Vegas. And then Tony kind of gets a point and gets grounded in that way of, he could be making things over dramatic, or he's not really in a situation that most people can sympathize with, at least from his perspective. But as just us as the audience, we get that. We get this losing your friends or losing people around you or being left alone and wanting to fill the void with something. It's a really great way to humanize Tony. It's a really great way to progress his character, or at least test the progression of his character, since he overcame something that's so absolutely human, like alcoholism. Tony is a lot more like a Batman than I ever gave him credit for, because there's always the comparison of Iron Man's a ripoff Batman, and he's not, but he's got the same sort of political philosophy going. Because Batman's got the Rawlsian sense of justice of, he's got money, so to offset the advantage, or to balance out the advantage he gets from money, he creates the advantage of people without money not having to worry about crime. So he's balancing out and giving you a very intentional distribution of a very intentional distribution of fairness, of equality, of justice. So even though you don't have, say, $18 billion, you can walk the streets home safe at night, because Batman's making that sacrifice with the advantage you've given him of money. Tony's got the same thing, except he doesn't see it as clearly as Batman does, because Tony's got the same thing of he's a billionaire, but he also always has to be involved in everyone's lives in his company. If any small person or any big person's fired or is going through trouble or is working through things, Tony feels it's almost a morally obligatory thing that he has to help them through it. Because what's the point of all this money, and if you're not going to give it back in equal proportion to how much you already have? And that's really cool. That's very that makes him much more of an endearing character, because Tony's always the guy that's making mistakes and constantly fixing them. And it's great to see him be more proactive, or more clearly proactive, and being more clearly a character that you can sort of look up to. Because using all your advantage for the sake of providing other people advantages is not an easy thing to pull off, but that's just what Tony's personality has become, and that's definitely interesting. The other thing to mention is there's a very clear through line of this story is this portion of the run is all about the past. It's constantly making references to things like how Tony as Iron Man met Rhodey in Vietnam, someone from Rhodey's Vietnam days coming back to meet him, Tony and Dr. Doom traveling to the past, quite literally there, someone from Beth's past being, namely her ex-husband, coming back to her present. It's this and then even like people that work for Tony, like his security chief has a shady past that causes backlash to show up, or blacklash to show up. His public relations officer's got a history, and a relationship with his kid that gets put more to the forefront here. So it's all about the past defining who people are, or at least resisting defining who you are. So the theme plays very interestingly in that not everyone can look at their life as completely and as wholly as you wish they could. They can't see all their mistakes, and they can't see everything that happened in the past to help them recover now. but it's all sort of coming ahead at the same time. So they all kind of need each other right now, and that's sort of the point of the story of you can't solve problems in isolation. There is a balance to strike between being comfortable by yourself and being able to rely on people, and Tony is learning that. And it works for his public relations officer and his security chief because he's able to help them out and they're able to trust that. And then Beth doesn't really get that lesson, so her ends do not turn out as well as they could have, because if she just had more help, or if she was just more open to getting that kind of help, maybe she would not have made the same mistake she made in her past, because she leaves Tony the same way she left her husband. So it's not that she didn't learn anything, it's just that she went so far in the other direction that she came back to the same result. And that's really interesting. So by the end of this, Tony and Beth's relationship has fallen through, and it's actually really tugging at your heartstrings, because this is a character that's grown to be so important to Tony and to his mental health, well-being, and to his psychology. Not that he's addicted to her or anything, but in the sense that this is the woman that pulled him through one of the darkest times in his life and some of the biggest hurdles in his life. So how is he able to keep going without her as a crutch? And he manages to work through it, but at the same time, there's still an emotional connection, and there's still it's not that I'm grateful to you, but there's a human relationship that I want to preserve with you. And that's something Tony can't necessarily bring himself to say, and that's something Beth can't bring herself to say, and they want to be together, but circumstances just prevent it because of the way the past works for each of them. So yeah, all that stuff's really interesting, and you kind of get back to the through line of the psychological stuff that's here. I will say that the strike against this book is the last 3 issues are really bad. The last 3 issues are essentially just really bare bones stories of Iron Man helping or saving somebody that don't really amount to much. And you get a really good story with the unicorn, but after that, there's just not a lot. The public relations officer and his kid, that story comes up in the last 3, but the ideas are not as great. The ideas are much better than the actual execution of them. Everything just kind of feels sort of dull by the end, because they're not talking about the psychology anymore. They feel like they've wrapped up their arc and they still have 3 more issues to write. So they're just kind of extra stories, or just kind of epilogues to the end of the actual story that they were telling. So that's not great. The other thing is Iron Man wears the same armor all the way through this entire run. So from 115 to 157, he's got his classic red and gold armor, and these writers introduce the space armor and they introduce the stealth armor, but they both are only there for an issue apiece. I would have really liked for Micheline and Layton, and I know they do this later, but I would have really liked them to end their run, or somewhere in the middle of their run, give Iron Man a new armor, or give them something of a new staple, because Iron Man's armor technology and its very specific gadgets and its very specific locations for certain tools is handled very consistently and very well throughout this whole run, where if his armor does one thing for one story, he makes sure that he constantly uses that. It's not like Batman's utility belt, where whatever you need is just always magically there, even if you foreshadowed it or not. Tony's got a very particular arsenal, and you always remember that arsenal, and you always make sure that you keep that arsenal in play through and through. But that can get kind of tired by the end, and it just makes you wonder there are all these situations where your very limited arsenal doesn't do you any good, and you had to work your way out of it with your mind. Why wouldn't you come up with some new solutions or a new armor by the end of the story? And that's not a glaring mistake, that's just a creative thing I wish they sort of addressed somewhere along the line. But as it stands, this is really good. You can get all of these issues in the Micheline, Layton, and Romita Jr. omnibus from Marvel. I'm not sure if it's still in print, but it collects their entire first run. And then after that, you can get Dennis O'Neill's Iron Man Epic Collection, The Enemy Within, which collects the first 20 issues of O'Neill's run. And so you can read both of these back to back, and it supplies a very good story. And of course there are more runs and more trades and stuff after that, but just as a primer on Iron Man, this omnibus is great, and as something of a follow-up, the Enemy Within trade is the perfect place to go afterwards. So yeah, this is really, really good. I don't think this run was ever as great as that first initial arc of 115 to 128. It's very top-heavy in that way. Nothing strikes a chord with you anywhere near as well as up to Demon in the Bottle. And it's not to say that 129 all the way to 157 are bad. It's just all you're doing is playing back to that arc and making sure you're developing the end of that arc. There's not a lot of new stuff that goes on. It's all just sort of aftermath of that first story. And that's okay. It's done really well. But it would have ultimately been a little bit cooler if there was a bigger through line, or if there was more arcs of that caliber throughout the run. Again, not a big complaint, because it is very much just taking its time and making sure you get all the ins and outs of Tony's psychology and his morality and his relationships with his friends as neatly as you can possibly deliver them. Because some of the complaints lobbed at Demon in the Bottle is that it's just one issue. And that's sort of fair and it's sort of not, because it's one issue to when he gets over drinking. But then it's an entire run from 129 to 157, making sure that the psychological ramifications of that are addressed. So it still works, but it makes the rest of the run kind of dull to read, because all you get is just every now and then some good character and some addressing of that issue, but more often than not, just kind of one-off stories with one-off villains that don't amount to more than that. They never build to a giant Justin Hammer thing like the way they did with that initial story. And Justin Hammer's in a later issue, but he's not the big bad at the end of it. And I kind of wish we got there. All that aside, it's a really good run. It's to Iron Man what Frank Miller was to Daredevil, and I highly recommend reading it or sorting it out. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments, and I will see you guys next time.